We decided to sleep in the truck after falling into the canyon. But then at first light, we made a big discovery. The discovery proves the power of the NASA Assault Division. The truck, with us in it, had been teleported out of the 1,000-foot deep canyon and gently placed in a rocky ditch beside the dirt road. NASA, I suspect using the Mandela effect, had totally erased the 1,000-foot canyon from existence. We were up against a mighty foe, but I felt we were up for it. Guess we didn't go over the cliff, remarked Larry. I didn't think we did, and I can pull us out of this ditch with my winch. I was becoming familiar with Larry's delusional thinking, so I explained to him what really happened. I explained that the NASA assault unit teleported us out of the canyon and inserted tracking devices both on us and on the truck. While I was explaining the situation to Larry, I saw a CIA stealth helicopter across the valley and 2 chemtrail aircraft directly overhead. Looking around a little harder, I saw a FBI operative down by the river, disguised as a fisherman. As Larry was hooking up the winch, I continued to explain our deteriorating situation. They have us surrounded and isolated. We need to find some copper wristbands to counteract the tracking signals. Either that or soak ourselves in a bath of buttermilk for at least 3 hours to discharge the batteries. That makes sense, said Larry as he winched the truck out of the ditch, and I checked my magnetic compass. The tractor death ray last night must have destroyed the vector fields of my compass, as it now says that this dirt road is going north to south, not east to west, I said, just as Larry got the truck running. The compass corrected itself, however, and gave the correct east to west reading once I got back in the truck. Clearly, a CIA stealth helicopter is jamming our compass readings. Outside of the truck, I thought, as the dust started building up inside the cab. Larry replied, "But shouldn't the sun be at our backs right now?" Again, I needed to set Larry straight on the flat earth science. According to the outdated globe earth theory, perhaps, but real science has proven that the sun may appear from any direction. I've proven this fact myself many times using this very compass. A few minutes later, we were stopped by a man in a fur coat and a fur hat. I later learned he went by the name of Ranger Dan. Ranger Dan was carrying an assault rifle, 2 bandoliers of ammunition, several hand grenades, and a machete tucked into his belt. He waved his assault rifle in the air and then pointed the weapon at us. "You are entering the sovereign nation of Clyde. State your business," ordered Ranger Dan. "We are sovereign citizens traveling to the flat earth ice wall, but NASA discovered our plan and is trying to stop us," I said to Ranger Dan through the passenger side window. "Last night, a NASA assault vehicle forced us over a cliff with a death ray, and during the night, they implanted tracking devices on us." Ranger Dan lowered his rifle and slung it over his shoulder. "Sovereign citizens, eh? What militia do you belong to?" We are not currently associated with a particular militia, but we support them all, as militias are required by the Constitution and the Postmaster General, I answered. So you are more into fixing the lies they are filling the heads of our children with, from fake history to fake science to fake government to fake money. The world is in a tragic state, and only courageous men of action, like us, can untangle the corrupt web of lies, said Ranger Dan. I thought Ranger Dan summed it up pretty well. It was wonderful to meet such a clear-headed person, especially now in our time of need. I summed up our plight in the following way. Problem is, we now have tracking devices implanted in our bodies. Already, a CIA stealth helicopter has scrambled our compass, and we have been sprayed by 2 chemtrail aircraft. Well, let's go up to the Fortress Clyde, replied Ranger Dan. I don't have any buttermilk, but I do have some copper wristbands. Ranger Dan jumped in the bed of the truck, and after making several sharp turns, we ended up parked next to a Sherman tank and an armored personnel carrier staged at the bottom of a steep hill. The tanks were both rusty. The gun on the Sherman tank was bent upward, and the bore of the gun appeared to be welded shut. Walking behind the tank, I noticed that the engine appeared to be missing. Brilliant, I thought to myself. Ranger Dan has camouflaged these vehicles to hide their true functionality. Now this guy has his act together, I remarked to Larry as we joined up with Ranger Dan at the bottom of the hill. We got to walk from here, as there's no road to Fortress Clyde. And also, follow close, as the whole mountain is booby-trapped with bungee sticks, claymores, and deadfalls. It was then I noticed that one of the pineapple grenades hanging from Ranger Dan's fur coat didn't have a pin or a spoon. Hit the dirt, I screamed as I leaped toward Ranger Dan to grab the armed grenade. In one elegant and athletic move, I grabbed the deadly grenade, and with no thought to my own safety, I threw it into the forest. That grenade was a dud, said Ranger Dan. I was taking it back to Fortress Clyde for repair. There didn't seem to be a marked path up the steep mountain, and Ranger Dan seemed to move straight up the hill, occasionally disarming tripwires. Halfway up, we saw a large pile of rocks suspended in a sling, hoisted high into the treetops. Don't step there, said Ranger Dan, or that whole 6 tons of rocks will do a gravity test on you. We could finally see Fortress Clyde as we crested the hill and crossed a suspension bridge spanning a dry moat. We dug it deep enough, but it never filled with water, remarked Ranger Dan. That's where we got the stone for the fortress. Fortress Clyde looked like an old-time medieval castle made of stone and with a gun tower at either end. As we got closer, I noticed that the flat stones that made up the walls of the castle were stacked up without mortar. We found that you could only enter the fortress by climbing a wooden ladder and entering from the top. Do you live here, Ranger Dan? Asked Larry as we walked across the main gun deck of the fortress. Sure do, answered Ranger Dan. Most secure homestead ever. Right in the heart of the sovereign nation of Clyde. In 10 years, I've never been attacked by another nation. From this fortress, I control the whole mountain, all the way around. At the top corner of the fortress, I noticed a small rusty steel structure with a rusty and frayed steel cable attached. The cable disappeared down the hill in direction of the tank parking lot. "What's this?" I asked Ranger Dan. Ranger Dan grabbed hold of one of the 4 swing-like seats hanging from the steel cable. "This is a zip line emergency escape device," he replied. "In case I'm overrun by overwhelming force, I can set the emergency destruct timer in the fortress and then slide down this zip line to safety." "Man, you got it all figured out," remarked Larry. "Let's go inside the fortress," suggested Ranger Dan. "It's starting to rain and this fur coat smells real bad when it gets too wet." The first thing I noticed inside the fortress was a deer carcass hanging from the ceiling and raccoon pelts stretched over some chair backs. Behind the deer carcass was an array of bells attached to the ceiling, each one connected to a strand of barbed wire that ran through the fortress walls and then outside. Ranger Dan left the door open, but it was still nearly as dark as a cave inside. Ranger Dan lit a lantern, and that's when I noticed an old-time looking still in front of a large fireplace at the far end of the room. I then passed by a side room with a sign over the door that read Armory. The armory room was fairly well lit, as the ceiling had a few stones missing, and both light and rain were pouring in. I figured that the armory must be where Ranger Dan kept all his old junk weapons, because all the rifles, grenades, knives, and ammunition were piled up in a rusty ball on the floor. "Man, that Ranger Dan is one organized guy," I thought to myself. Ranger Dan put 2 canning jars filled with a clear liquid and 3 metal coffee cups on a large wooden table located in the middle of the room. "Well," said Ranger Dan, "this is home. Sit and make yourself to home. Have a snort." "What is it?" asked Larry. "Moonshine. Firewater," answered Ranger Dan. "It's how I pay the bills around here. But it's a little harsh." It began to storm outside as we gathered around the table and began to talk. I could hear both the wind howling and the rain pelting the walls of the fortress. Water was leaking in everywhere, then running across the floor and finally making its way out under the foundation stones. The only dry spot seemed to be the big wooden table we were sitting around. "Where are the other members of the Clyde militia?" asked Larry as he belted back his second cup of liquor. "They all quit 7 or so years ago," answered Ranger Dan. "Cowardice in the face of the enemy," I said, mumbling and slurring my words. "That attack by the chemical planes this morning is starting to affect me. I'm getting dizzy." "No," said Ranger Dan. "The guys got mad because we built this fortress and nobody ever attacked us." After a couple of hours, we were all feeling the effects of being sprayed by the FEMA chemical planes. Larry was asleep in a pool of water on the floor, and Ranger Dan was using his rubber band shooting gun to kill flies. Then the attack started. I don't know if it was NASA or the CIA or FEMA, but we were being overrun by a large force of well-trained insurgents. We knew the insurgents were charging up the hill because the bells on the ceilings, it turns out, were all attached to tripwires on the hill below us. Thunder was pounding and lightning was striking all around us. The wind blew so hard, it blew off the entryway door. The insurgents were using this weather event to mask their attack. But they didn't fool me because, as Ranger Dan said, we were men of action. Ranger Dan tried to stand up and take care of the entry door, but he collapsed into a heap on the floor from the effects of the FEMA chemical plane attack. I hated to leave Ranger Dan behind, but I had to continue our mission to the ice wall. I woke Larry up and drug him to the entryway hatch. Rain was pouring in and the wind almost pushed us over as branches and leaves went flying past our heads. I figured some of their heavy weapons had taken down some trees nearby and we would be next. We struggled over to the wooden ladder to where the wooden ladder was a few hours before, but it was gone, blown away by the wind. But then I remembered the zip line. We crawled over to the zip line to stay out of the range of fire from the insurgents, and I rigged Larry into the seat. "What do I do?" asked Larry, as I got into the seat just behind him. "Just hold on," I shouted over the howling wind. "Here you go." I gave Larry a push and he went speeding down the hill. Once he was a few yards downhill, I launched myself. A second later, I noticed that the attacking insurgents had cleverly toppled a tree across the zip line, and Larry was going to crash into it at 40 miles per hour. I remember Larry and I smashing into the tree, but I don't remember hitting the ground 20 feet below us.